straight A's into the very worst 5th grade class the next year. And that classroom environment was a zoo. I mean, it was unbelievable. People were in the classroom fighting with the teacher, cursing him out, fighting with each other. It was unbelievable. And in that environment, I did what everybody else was doing. I acted up, I acted a fool. But we had a teacher named Mr. Lefkowitz, who was an older Jewish man. And it was something about his compassion. And he treated us, despite the fact that we were terrible to him. He treated us like we were important and that we mattered. And I remembered every Friday afternoon, he would set some time aside for us, and he would allow us to bring in our own music. He would buy pizza for us. And so you have to have a vision of this sight of this old 70-year-old Jewish man with all of these crazy, rambunctious minority kids listening to hip-hop and eating pizza and dancing and rhyming and having a great time. No matter what we did during the week, he gave us that opportunity to show us love. And at the end of the school year, and I didn't realize the power in this until I was an adult, he pulled me aside and said, "You don't belong in this environment. You are a brilliant young man. What I am going to do is place you back in the talented and gifted program next year. And I want you to stay there. I believe in you. Because if you stay on this track, something bad is going to happen to you, and society is going to lose the contributions of what could one day be a brilliant, positive man with something to contribute to society." And that amazes me when I think about that today. Because I went in the 6th grade back into the talented and gifted program. I wound up skipping a grade. A couple of years later, I got a scholarship to a very prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts, where I met people from all over the world. And I was coming from a situation in Brooklyn where some of my friends were talking about coming home from Spofford. And for those of you that don't know or may not have watched the Mike Tyson special on HBO, Spofford is the youth prison. So I come from that environment to getting a scholarship to this prestigious boarding school where people are coming back and talking about their experiences at Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And Mr. Lefkowitz, who did not have to give me that opportunity, made a decision about my life. He cared about me. And I didn't know that. But his decision propelled me to a different place. So I go to this fancy boarding school in Massachusetts. I'm a city kid from New York. I go up there with 7 pairs of sneakers, one for each day. And I noticed that these rich kids have a pair of shoes that looks like they've been wearing it for 20 years. And just an amazing, amazing experience to meet some phenomenal people. And Mr. Lefkowitz was one of those people, and I'll share some of the other phenomenal people that I've had an opportunity to come across. When I was a senior at Milton Academy in Massachusetts, we had a student come in from South Africa. And his name was Craig Hosias. And in his South African dialect, it sounded like, and the way he would say it is, "My name is Craig Hosias." And he had this power about him. And it was something that I wasn't used to seeing. And I don't know if you are familiar, some of the young guys, with the apartheid regime in South Africa. At the time, Nelson Mandela was still incarcerated. It was a very difficult place for a young black man to grow up in. And he was so passionate about South Africa. And that blew me away. And we were eating lunch one day, and I said, Craig, now that you're here in America, and you have an opportunity to go to a great college, you can get a degree, you can be a lawyer or a doctor, you can make a whole lot of money, you can stay here, and you don't ever have to go back to that. And he looked at me like I had 7 heads. He said, I am going back to South Africa. I will die for South Africa because I believe in South Africa. And that was a very humbling moment to me because I could not think of anything that I was willing to die for, maybe other than my mother. He was willing to do that for his country, which treated him terribly. But he had that passion and that love. And that made me start to think, what am I passionate about? What am I willing to die for? And it changed my outlook and my life. I shared with the gentleman earlier that I had done some volunteer work in New York City and began working with the YMCAs and the YWCAs and the New York Knicks organization, working with young people. And we talk about the impact that a person can have on the life of a young person. And I didn't truly realize that impact until I met a young man named Theodore. We had a summer camp program. And Theodore was in what we call the kinder camp program. He was the cutest little guy, but he was nonverbal. He didn't talk. But you could see this beauty emanating from his face. And you could sense this wonderful spirit inside of him. And the woman who adopted him said, Theodore was almost drowned when he was a baby. And he just doesn't talk. And when the other kids would go to the pool, when he would see the water, he would shut his eyes and he would start hitting himself and he would turn away and run. And every morning, Theodore walked in the door and I'd say, good morning, Theodore. How you doing today? Who's the man? And he'd just look at me and I'd say, you the man. Every day he walked in. What's up, Theodore? How you doing today? Who's the man? And he'd just look at me. And I'd say, you the man. 2 months later, the last day of camp, Theodore walks in with his mother just like every other day. He walks up and I'm there to meet him and I said, Theodore, who's the man? And he said, you the man. I said, no, you the man. And his mother broke down in tears. Those were the first words she heard him speak. I didn't know I could have that type of impact on an individual. And it was very powerful for me. When I decided that I wanted to merge my love of the written word with my love and passion for sports, I had one article that was published in a local newspaper in Baltimore. And it was about a guy named Butch Beard, who was a former NBA player, and he was a coach with the New Jersey Nets. Some of you may remember he coached Drazen Petrovic and Derek Coleman and Kenny Anderson. Butch Beard was given the opportunity to coach the worst college basketball team in the country at the time, which was Morgan State University. And I just thought that that was very interesting that this guy who played with Wes Unseld in college at the University of Louisville, for those of us old heads in the room who know who Wes Unseld is, to give you guys, some young guys, some clarity. You guys watch the NBA and you watch Kevin Love, great rebounder, great leader. That's who Wes Unseld was. So I wrote this story about Butch Beard, and it got, you know, some really good reviews locally in Baltimore, but that was the one story clip that I had. And I went to this journalism conference in Dallas, Texas. And all of the big boys were there. ESPN was there, the Washington Post was there, the New York Times was there. And I had my one clip, and I would walk up to people and introduce myself and tell them who I was, and I would hand them a copy of my clip. And the majority of those folks said, "Is this all you have?" They didn't even take the time to read it. And they said, "Well, if you want to work for the Washington Post, what you need to do is you need to go work for a small newspaper in Ohio. If you want to get published by the New York Times, you need to go somewhere and get back to me in a couple of years." But there was one gentleman, there was a dinner set up, and Mario Ely, who was a two-time NBA champion with the Houston Rockets, was the featured speaker. And the gentleman that introduced him, somehow, some way, I felt a connection to him. He was an African-American man. He was from New York City like I was. His energy was palpable. And it was like, you know what? I know this guy, even though I don't really know this guy. So I was sitting at his table with Stuart Scott from ESPN and some other bigwigs in the industry. And remember, I'm nobody. I'm this guy with one newspaper clip that nobody wants to read. And I asked a question from Mario Ely once they had the question and answer session. And then I went to introduce myself to the gentleman whose name was Gary Howard, who introduced him afterwards. And he said, I said, "Hello, my name is Ali, and I really just felt something in your words," and I told him about myself and who I was. And he said, "Man, that was the most intelligent, brilliant question I ever heard in my life." Stopped by, at the time he was the sports editor of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And he said, "Stop by our table downstairs at the job fair and drop off some of your stuff and let's talk." So when I went to the table, he wasn't there. So there was a gentleman sitting there. I said, "Can you please give this to Gary Howard?" It was the copy of the one story that I had written. He said, "Okay, I'll do that." Went to a bunch of other tables and met some people and started talking, collecting business cards. But quite honestly, I was a little down on myself because the voices that I heard was, "You can't. You only have one clip. What makes you think you can write for the New York Times?" That's what I heard and what I felt. So I'm going up the escalator. Gary Howard is coming down the escalator. And as I passed him, he said, "Young brother, meet me at the bottom of the escalator." Went up, came down, met him at the bottom of the escalator. He said, "I read that story that you wrote." He said, "Let me ask you one question." I said, "What?" He said, "Can you do that every time?" I said, "Does a bear defecate in the woods?" "Yes, I can." And from that day forward, he became my mentor. He mentored Stephen A. Smith when Stephen A. Smith was writing about high school sports at the Daily News in New York City. He mentors a lot of young African-American, minority, female people that want to work in sports and media. And he encouraged me. He told me that I could get published in the New York Times. And about a month or two after I met Gary Howard, I had a story in the New York Times. But I put the energy out there that this is what I wanted to do. And I made an effort to go introduce myself to this man and shake his hand. And we connected. Where everybody else I gave that story to, I doubt any of them probably even read it. But he took the time to read it. And